Does financial data warrant special attention when it comes to data sharing policies, particularly with government bodies? Today, we're taking a look at lessons from ongoing debates from North America, paying particular attention to the hearing of the subcommittee of the US House of Representatives Judiciary Committee on the 7th of March as part of an inquiry into the 6th January incident of 2021 at Capitol Hill. Hi and welcome to Lex Novus.
Yeah.
Government surveillance is in general a more contested notion in Western democratic states, particularly those with entrenched privacy rights. For that reason, certain debates there can seem out of place in Asian jurisdictions, where we are more willing to exchange freedoms for structured stability. But as the mechanisms of surveillance develop, particularly with the use of data and technology, we must begin to assess the risks posed by excessive intrusion into the individual citizen's fundamental rights through controlling measures. Coming to the US subcommittee hearing, let's come up to speed with what it's about. On 6 January 2021, protests against the results of the US presidential 2020 elections in front of the Capitol building devolved into a riot which saw just over 1,000 people storm the building. The incident, which was considerably shocking for a democratic state like the US, is referred to now as an incident of domestic terrorism. Individuals involved have been prosecuted and are serving sentences. Following this incident, an FBI whistleblower declared that in the lead up to the storming, the Bank of America, with no directive from the FBI, data mined its customer base by compiling customers who had used a Bank of America debit or credit card between January 5th and January 7th, 2021. The Bank of America then provided the FBI voluntarily and without legal process with a list of those customers. This information was used to profile individuals, for example, people who had previously purchased a firearm with the Bank of America product. They were elevated to the top of the list regardless of when or where the purchase was made. On January 10, 2023, 2 years later, the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government was established to investigate these alleged abuses of federal authority, including collusion between federal agencies and private sector entities. This subcommittee sits as part of the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives and is chaired by Jim Jordan, a Republican. The subcommittee has had other hearings since its establishment. On this panel sat 5 individuals: Brian Knight, a senior research fellow of George Mason University with a focus on financial regulations; Jeremy Tedesco, senior counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom; Norbert Michel from the Cato Institute, an American think tank; former police officer Fanon, who was present on the ground during the riots; and the celebrity of the panel and only Canadian, Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now that we've got context, let's get to the meat of the discussion. The testimony of Brian Knight set the tone of the issue. Knight described how the government was and is able to access financial information without due process, i.e. without a warrant. The FBI simply wrote into the bank, and the bank responded with the information requested. In particular, the 6th January incident information was obtained pursuant to the Secrecy Act, which allowed for constitutionally protected information to be collected without informing the data subject. Knight highlighted how the current financial system and data within it allows for a creation of a profile, though not perfect, of a person's life. In the case of the 6th January incident, the focus was on firearm purchases. However, this can easily be extended to other spheres. It is important to note that Knight and other panel members were not suggesting that the FBI should not have access to financial data. Instead, it should be done through due process. This position is important because members of the committee opposing the position of the panel primarily hinged on the argument that the insurrection of Capitol Hill warranted such intrusion by the FBI. Knight's co-panelist, Michelle, echoed his sentiment, stating that the Bank Secrecy Act should not have been passed in the first place. He showed how there was an attempt by the legislature to counter the Secrecy Act by passing the Right to Financial Privacy Act, but this counter-act was overly watered down. Decisions by the US courts have not been helpful either, with the prevailing declaration being that there can be no expectation of privacy from the government in financial information, even though due process is required for cellular phone data. This, he claims, sits in opposition to the Fourth Amendment protection from government intrusion, and financial records should not be an exception. Why the fuss particularly about financial data? In a question posed by a committee member to Knight, he described what can be known through financial records. Almost everything. Location, spending, interests, secular belief, abortion, and other sensitive medical information. From this, predictive models can create profiles of an individual with a significant degree of confidence for each parameter. When comparing this data with cellular phone data, he argued that financial data was significantly more comprehensive. The testimony of Jeremy Tedesco was particularly revealing on the risk of collusion between banking institutions and the state. This is seen through the act of debanking. Debanking is the closure of an individual or organization's bank accounts by banks that perceive the account holders to pose a financial, legal, regulatory, or reputational risk to the bank. While this is an acceptable safety measure for both the state and banks, collusion between the two has resulted in instances of viewpoint-based debanking. Tedesco cited the example of the Bank of America debanking a long-standing account of the Advanced International Ministries, an international NGO aimed at helping impoverished widows and orphaned and vulnerable children in Uganda. After 8 years of operating the account, the organization received a notice that stated simply that the bank has determined you're operating a business type we have chosen not to service at the Bank of America. This, Tedesco argued, was a clear move towards what he described as religious debanking. In another example, Tedesco highlighted how his own organization was debanked suddenly following an inquiry by the US Treasury Financial Crimes Unit working with big banks. Tedesco's organization, a Christian conservative advocacy group, was cited alongside hate groups and listed as a domestic terrorist group. It is telling that none of the committee members chose to address the examples cited by Tedesco, raising questions of the risk of political bias in the banking sector through punishing customers for their viewpoints. This is described as the weaponizing of the financial marketplace. The committee's chairman equated this issue to what has come to be known as the Canadian trucker protests. In that protest, Canadian truckers protested against the long-standing COVID lockdown measures. During the protest, they vented their frustrations on the government, calling for a change in leadership. The government seized on the opportunity and, citing insurrection as a basis, froze the accounts of 57 individuals, including individuals not involved in the protests, but had only contributed money to the protesters. Following challenges to the freezing of accounts, the Canadian Federal Court ruled that the government's actions were unreasonable and an unjustified infringement on rights. Jordan Peterson's testimony took a step away from the specifics of the 6 January incident and even banking data. He drew attention to the overall risk of unbridled collaboration between the state and private institutions. A primary example he cited was China's Skynet surveillance network and their social scoring system, both of which, he argued, creates an Orwellian-esque surveillance state. Importantly, he highlighted that there is no longer conjecture, as the tools to carry out this intention are ready, available, and growing in capacity, particularly due to AI. With the current climate of distrust and lack of transparency surrounding the government's use of personal data of citizens, Malaysia may want to explore the landscape of potential surveillance by the utilization of financial data. To do this, we will narrow down the question to whether or not enforcement bodies can obtain financial data legally from financial institutions for the purposes of surveillance. There is no doubt that the constitutional rights afforded in the US under the Fourth Amendment is considerably different from Malaysia's position. In Malaysia, enforcement bodies have the power under their respective statutory provisions to obtain information, including financial information of an individual, in the course of investigation. That power is not unmitigated, though. First, we look at the right of enforcement agencies to make a request for financial information. The police, for example, have the power to investigate any committed offence based on reasonable suspicion under the Criminal Procedure Code. Similarly, investigations under the Anti-Corruption Act allow investigations into financial records, but again, under committed offences. Unusually, though, the 6th January financial data obtained was premised on a potential crime, not a committed one. This is one of the features of data intrusion, leading to the argument of surveillance. In Malaysia, however, under limited circumstances, the police have the power to investigate based on potential crimes under the Prevention of Crime Act. It could be argued that this right is extended to financial data. On the front of the right of financial institutions to disclose data to enforcement agencies, the Development of Financial Institutions Act 2002 provides in Section 120 sub 1J permitted disclosures to a police officer. Where such disclosure is authorized under any federal law to be made to a police officer investigating into any offence under such law, and such disclosure to the police officer being in any case limited to the accounts and affairs of the person suspected of the offence. Additionally, the Financial Services Act permits disclosure by a financial institution of customer information to certain specific bodies specified in Schedule 11 of the Act. Interesting to note is that in addition to criminal proceedings and in the course of investigation, Schedule 11's permitted disclosure includes where a financial institution has reason to suspect that an offence under any written law has been, is being, or may be committed. Based on the statute, it is clear that enforcement agencies under the purview of the executive have the power to obtain financial data of banking customers, and correspondingly, financial institutions have the power to disclose such data. However, the use of financial data for surveillance, particularly for extended periods of time and with great speculation, is not explicitly provided for in any of the statutes. Neither are there provisions for the building of predictive profiles. It seems reasonable to assume that, similar to the position in the US, these statutes, or rather the gaps in these statutes, will nevertheless be used as a basis should the need arise for these purposes. It would therefore boil down to the constitutionality of any provision relied on by an enforcement agency in surveillance of an individual. Also, an important consideration is whether an obligation arises under any of these provisions to notify the data subject, as in a situation of collusion, it would be them that would intend to launch a challenge. There is a lot more to consider in this conversation, such as the role of the central bank and transparency of government agencies. If you are exploring this area, while keeping the US subcommittee's outcome on the issue in mind, you may also want to look at how other Asian countries are approaching the issue. As usual, research and resource links are in the description. See you next time on Lex Novus.
Yeah.